A young woman left home and stopped answering her phone, so her parents went to the police. Detectives quickly started turning up one alarming lead after another, and it didn't take long before a pretty grim picture began to emerge. And once they uncovered the full truth, the case made national headlines because its details shook people to their core. Megan Newborough was born in August 1997 in a small British town called Nuneaton, not far from Birmingham. She grew up in a big, close-knit family. She had an older sister and a younger brother. When she was just 2, her parents signed her up for dance classes, and from that point on, dancing became one of the biggest parts of her life. She also adored animals, and she was always begging her parents to let her have pets like hamsters, dogs, and even rabbits. Megan had a tight group of friends from an early age, and they all said the same thing about her. She was genuinely kind, knew how to show up for people when things got tough, and she had this way of really understanding what someone else was going through. After school, she studied at a local college, then landed a job in HR at a large brick manufacturing company. She settled in quickly, won over her coworkers, and started making plans for the future. The summer of 2021 was a big moment for her. Megan was 23, and she'd already managed to buy her first place. She was supposed to get the keys just a few days before her birthday, and she couldn't wait to move in with her dog. Until then, she was still living with her parents in her hometown. On August 6th, at around 7:30 in the evening, she told her mom she was going out to meet someone for a walk, got into her car, and drove off. Her parents expected her back within a couple of hours, but by 9:30 she still wasn't home. They texted her, then tried calling, but Megan didn't answer. She wasn't responding on social media either, and they started to worry. Still, Megan was almost 24 and very independent, so they decided to wait until morning. They figured she might have stayed over at someone's place or gone somewhere with friends, but she never got in touch. And by morning, her parents decided to call the police. Megan's older sister told officers that the night before, Megan had been planning to meet up with her boyfriend, a 30-year-old man named Ross. They'd met at work a few years earlier, but they'd only started dating recently. Her sister said Megan described him as kind, caring, and a genuinely decent guy, and that the relationship was going great. Police went to speak with him, while other officers started tracking Megan's car using an automatic license plate reader system. They quickly saw that at 9:30 p.m., about 2 hours after she'd left home, her car had been spotted on camera in a nearby town, roughly a 40-minute drive away. But that still didn't answer the big question. Why hadn't she come home? When officers arrived at Ross's house in Colville, they found his parents there, but Ross himself wasn't home. His mom and dad said he'd gone to a nearby town to visit a local bar, so officers called him. Ross told them Megan had come over to his place the night before and stayed for about an hour while his parents were out. Then he said she headed home, telling him she was going to stop at McDonald's on the way for a milkshake. Ross also said he'd been trying to reach her all day, but she wasn't responding. According to him, he'd texted her a few times the night before and got nothing back. He assumed she'd made it home and fallen asleep, but when she still hadn't replied the next day, he kept messaging her. Given that police had called Ross while they were literally standing inside his house, and his parents agreed to let them look around, officers decided to do a quick walkthrough and see if anything fell off. When they stepped into the living room, they saw it was a mess. There was stuff scattered across the floor, and a large damp stain soaking into the carpet. Ross's parents said he'd spilled coffee there, but they admitted they hadn't actually seen it happen, since they hadn't been home the night before. As they moved further in, officers spotted red stains along the baseboard in the hallway that looked like blood, so they called in forensic techs to collect samples and send them to the lab. Soon enough, the results came back. The red marks on the baseboard were Megan's blood. So later that night, police returned to Ross's parents' house and arrested him on suspicion of kidnapping. Ross stayed oddly calm. He even asked if he could put on socks before they took him to the station. As they were cuffing him, one officer asked straight up where Megan was. Ross barely whispered, "Can we talk about this at the station?" But the officer pushed back. Even a whispered answer would do. He could tell Ross didn't want his parents to hear, so he kept his tone friendly, trying not to scare off what sounded like a possible confession. Ross leaned in and murmured, "She's in Woodhouse Eaves." It was a tiny village near the same town where he'd been sitting in a bar earlier that day. Then, he got more specific and named a rural road just outside the village. The officer then asked if she was okay, but Ross quietly said, no. He also added one more thing. Ross said he'd been planning to call police himself the next morning. When detectives drove Ross to the station, their colleagues headed straight to the area he'd named, searching the road with canine units. It was already the middle of the night, and the stretch of road ran for miles, but they weren't about to waste a second. Before long, they also caught in a helicopter, and the crew started scanning from above, trying to spot Megan. Not long after that, officers noticed a small patch of flattened grass a few yards off the road near a low stone wall, so they walked over to take a closer look. When one of them shined a flashlight over the wall, he saw a woman's body. Part of her clothing was missing, and there were clean injuries around her neck. They immediately knew it was Megan. Medical examiners later came to a chilling conclusion. Megan died from strangulation, and only after she was already dead did the killer stab her in the neck 14 times. Meanwhile, police located Megan's car. It had been abandoned in the parking lot of a college in a nearby town. Forensics found Megan's blood on the front passenger seat, and nearby they recovered a glove that contained Ross's DNA. On top of that, investigators requested location data from Megan's phone and learned something else. Since the night she vanished, it had been sitting in a field not far from Ross's home. And because the phone was still on when it was left there, the data was precise enough for officers to go right to it and find it in the grass. When they examined the phone, they also found Megan's messages with Ross. The text showed that on the night she disappeared, she indeed drove to his house. After the murder, Ross started messaging her and leaving voice messages, acting like he was worried she wasn't responding. The next day, with Megan's body already lying out in that field, he kept texting her, pretending he had no idea where she'd gone. By lining those messages up with the car's movements on surveillance cameras, police were able to piece together what happened in the hours after the murder. Ross, who didn't have his own car or even a driver's license, had been driving Megan's car around the area, with her body sitting in the front passenger seat, dumping evidence along the way. That trail led investigators to security footage near a fitness center. It showed Ross pulling into the lot, getting out, and tossing various items into a trash can. One camera even caught him changing clothes right there by the car, stuffing what he'd been wearing into a bag and throwing that bag in the bin too. After that, he didn't get back into the car at all. He just left it there and took a taxi home. Police immediately collected everything from those trash containers, and inside, they found blood-stained clothing belonging to Megan, rags with blood on them, her glasses, and Ross's own clothes as well. At that point, investigators had a pretty solid working timeline. Megan likely arrived at his place around 9 p.m., and about 40 minutes later, he strangled her, then stabbed her in the neck over and over, and started trying to cover his tracks. But there was still one key piece missing: motive. That changed pretty quickly. Even before detectives sat Ross down for a formal interview, they went back through his earlier messages with Megan. In those texts, Ross admitted he struggled with erectile dysfunction, and he said he blamed it on the ADHD medication he had to take. Megan didn't pull away from him. Instead, she told him she'd support him. A few weeks later, Ross started talking about wanting to try being intimate with her, but based on their messages, it didn't work. And after that, his texts started getting more and more angry and aggressive, while Megan kept trying to calm him down and reassure him. Detectives also searched his computer, and that only added to the pile of evidence. At around 11 p.m., basically right after he got home from dumping Megan's body, Ross Googled, "How to tell a girl you love her." Minutes later, he left Megan a voice message saying he was worried and didn't understand why she wasn't answering. Then things took an even darker turn. Right after recording that message, Ross started looking up articles about 3 well-known killers. He opened multiple pages about Levi Belfield, who murdered at least 3 women, then read about Ian Huntley, responsible for 2 murders, and after that, he pulled up several articles about Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper. After that, his phone and computer went quiet until the next morning. But at around 6:30 a.m., he was back at it, searching articles about serial killers again, while also visiting an adult site and watching videos focused on violence and humiliation. When he was done, he texted Megan, "Morning, babe." Not long after that, he started Googling the safest prisons in Britain, who cuts inmates' hair, and other questions about what life in prison is like. So, in a short window of time, investigators had built a pretty overwhelming picture of what Ross had been doing and what likely happened to Megan. But they still needed to interview him, and the story he told didn't match the narrative detectives had worked out. From the beginning, Ross didn't deny killing her. He admitted it, but he claimed it happened during an argument and that he lost control. He said he strangled Megan, then went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and stabbed her in the neck over and over. As for what set him off, Ross gave detectives his explanation. He said that years earlier he'd been abused, and that it had affected him ever since. That night, when they tried to be intimate, he claimed to trigger flashbacks of that trauma, and he snapped. He also told him that at the start of that breakdown, he'd managed to pull away from Megan, but that she tried to comfort him and came closer. That's when, he said, he attacked and killed her. Still, investigators didn't buy some crucial parts of Ross's story. To them, it looked like he was trying to steer this toward a manslaughter, something with a much lighter sentence. What they believed actually set him off was much simpler. He couldn't have sex with her again. Detectives learned that not long before the murder, Ross had ordered erectile dysfunction pills online. He was likely hoping they'd fix the problem, but it still didn't work. And in the investigators' eyes, that mix of anger and embarrassment is what pushed him over the edge. Ross also admitted Megan was one of the very few people he'd ever told about his condition. Investigators thought he may have been terrified she'd tell someone else, even though, by all accounts, Megan had only ever been supportive and understanding. And then there were Ross's searches right after the killing. Detectives believed he had an unhealthy obsession with serial killers, sexual depravity, and violence, and that he wasn't just panicking after the murder. He was indulging something. In their view, he got real gratification from the idea of committing a brutal crime, and with his impotence issues, that may have been the only thing that made him feel in control. Finally, investigators pointed to how hard he tried to cover it up, and the fact that he only admitted to killing Megan after he was arrested. He didn't just dump her body and get rid of evidence. He also kept texting her, trying to make it look like he had no idea where she'd gone. He just didn't think through the basics. Ross likely didn't expect to be caught on multiple security cameras tossing bloodstained items and driving Megan's car around. He also didn't think to power off her phone before he ditched it in a field, which is exactly why police were able to locate it. And he probably didn't realize detectives could pull his browser history and see the serial killer searches and the violent adult content he'd been watching. But despite all of that, Ross kept pushing the same line. It wasn't a premeditated murder. It was a loss of control. So, the case went to court. Ross's lawyer tried to convince the jury that it all came down to an uncontrollable burst of rage, triggered by Ross's past trauma, along with his struggles with depression and anxiety. He even went into the trauma in detail, saying Ross had been abused by a man named Stephen Bidman, who in 2016 was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 35 years before parole for a different crime. Bidman and a friend had kidnapped and killed a young woman, but he didn't spend long behind bars, and later died of a heart attack. The case became one of the most infamous in the UK, and it's been covered in several major documentaries. Still, none of that convinced the jury that Ross was being truthful, and the prosecution's version of events felt far more solid to them. The trial wrapped up in December 2022, and it took the jury just an hour and a half to reach a verdict. Ross was found guilty of murder and was given a life sentence, with the chance of parole no earlier than 23 years. Not long after sentencing, the Attorney General's office asked the court to increase Ross's minimum term. They argued that, in their view, the crime had a sexualized element, given Ross's fixation on serial killers and violent adult materials. But the Court of Appeal rejected that request, saying there wasn't convincing evidence of a sexual motive or sexual context in what happened. So the sentence stayed the same, and Ross could be eligible for release when he's in his early 50s. It's also worth noting that during the trial, Ross repeatedly broke down in tears, but Megan's family didn't believe it was genuine. In their eyes, he never showed real remorse and kept clinging to his own version of the story. After Megan's death, her parents founded a nonprofit in her memory. The goal is to support initiatives that protect women from violence. And they also donate part of the money to a dog welfare charity because Megan absolutely loved dogs. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section. And don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.